With the release of the Dune movies by Denis Villeneuve, a lot of people are becoming interested in this fascinating fictional universe. The books by Frank Herbert are considered some of the greatest masterpieces in science fiction literature, especially that first book, and the world that he built is a deep, complex, and really engaging one that tackles themes of religion, philosophy, ecology, politics, and much else. I'm sure many of you who have watched the movies have recognized many of the themes and terms, like the Mahdi and the lisan al-gaib. In fact, when creating Dune, Frank Herbert drew a lot of inspiration from different religious traditions, and particularly Middle Eastern and North African culture. For this reason, we find a lot of themes related to Islam and Sufism, but also a bunch of different religious traditions from around the world. I know this episode has been requested by a lot of you for a long time, and I thought that with the excitement over the new movies, it was high time to explore the intriguing world of Dune and its many religious themes. Dune is a series of science fiction novels written by Frank Herbert from the 1960s through the 80s. The first book, Dune, came out in 1965 and introduces an intricate universe where the story is centered around the desert planet Arrakis, where the desert sand contains something called spice, a substance that can basically be used to run whole empires, but it's also greatly hallucinogenic to humans who are exposed to it. The story revolves, on the one hand, around political intrigues between different houses or clans that try to control Arrakis in order, of course, to control the spice. The famous quote summarizes this well, quote, "He who controls the spice controls the universe." But on the planet of Arrakis, there also lives an indigenous population called the Fremen, who live in the desert and are greatly oppressed by the many political powers that try to control the planet. But they also await a certain savior figure, the so-called Mahdi, that is prophesied to save them from this oppression. Already you can probably see some of the key themes in the book that reflect aspects of real life, such as colonialism and messianism. Now, full disclosure, I haven't actually read the full Dune book. I did start reading it a couple of years ago because I've always been intrigued by this universe and this series. But, you know, it's a lot, as many of you probably know. So many houses and names and cultures and planets and all this stuff. It was just, I felt like I didn't have the mental energy or time at that time to tackle all that. So I never finished the book. But I am generally aware of the universe and the plot and everything that goes on in that universe because I've sort of absorbed it over the years through pop culture and just because I've been interested in this series. And of course, I've also greatly enjoyed the new movies by Denis Villeneuve. But what I mean to say by this is that there are sort of elements of this analysis that are unavailable to me because I have not read the book. So keep that in mind, that I don't have the same amount of knowledge about the lore and all this that people who are actual, like, devoted fans of these books that have read the books might have. But I do still think that I have enough knowledge and there are enough very clear and obvious parallels in this universe with real-life religions, for example, that it enables me to make or to have a really interesting discussion here about some of these themes. Frank Herbert was an ecologist and journalist, but became primarily known as a science fiction author after the immense success of the Dune books, starting, as we said, in 1965. It seems that he had a vast array of different interests, all of which were gathered into Dune and its many different themes. It's clear that he studied religions and the culture of the Middle East, and he also appears to have been familiar with the writings of people like Jung and Heidegger, Freud, and also studied Zen Buddhism, which we can definitely sense in the books. It also seems somewhat clear that he had studied or was familiar with Islam and Sufism, possibly through the writings of people like Henri Corbin, which we will see later. And generally, he must have had a great interest and knowledge of different religions generally, albeit perhaps not that deep of an understanding of particular traditions per se. Whatever the case, the different interests of Herbert, from religion to ecology, politics, and philosophy, they all show up in one way or another as important themes in Dune. Deeply embedded in the story are thus influences from Middle Eastern, North African, and Islamic culture and religion. The Fremen, the indigenous population of Arrakis, was inspired by Arab and Amazigh, also known as Berber, tribal culture, and it is peppered with different Islamic themes. The political implications of the story are obvious. The great empire subduing the local population to control the spice trade is a clear nod to and critique perhaps of things like colonialism and the imperial struggles to control natural resources like oil, and of course the oppression that often accompanies such a venture. But within this wider world and story, there are also outright religious themes that are borrowed from the real world. And I will have to get into some spoilers about the general story here to explore it properly, so this is your warning for that. The story of Dune, at least the first book, basically revolves around Paul Atreides, known also as the muad'dib, a royal of the house of Atreides who, after very dramatic political circumstances, becomes basically a part of the Fremen people, the indigenous population. Eventually, he also becomes identified with a messianic figure that they are expecting to liberate them from oppression, called the Mahdi, or also the Lisan al-gaib. Now, both of these terms are real Arabic phrases and have a direct connection with Islamic religion and lore. The Mahdi is a very prominent concept in Islam and denotes, much like in Dune, an expected messianic figure that will come at the end of time to help rid the world of evil and injustice in time for Judgment Day. It is common belief in Islam that Jesus will also return at this time, and the role of the Mahdi and Jesus are very much interconnected. The idea of the Mahdi exists in both Sunni and Shi'i Islam, but is perhaps most prominent in Shi'ism. Here, the idea of the Messianic Mahdi is one of the core characteristics of their view of the world and of religious history. And in the Twelver branch of Shi'ism, the largest branch of Shia Islam today, the identity of this Mahdi is actually known. Indeed, the Twelvers are called the Twelvers precisely because they believe that there are 12 hereditary imams that succeeded the Prophet Muhammad. The imam in Shi'ism is probably their most important and characteristic concept. It is the idea that when the Prophet Muhammad died, succession to lead his community, both politically and spiritually, was handed down in his family in a patrilineal line of imams, which started with his cousin and son-in-law, Ali, and then being handed down in the family from him. The Twelvers, so-called, believe that there are precisely 12 such imams, starting with Ali and ending with Muhammad ibn Hassan, who was imam in the 9th and 10th centuries. What is unique about this 12th imam is that the Shi'is believe that he never actually died. He was in hiding for a large portion of his life, only communicating with his community through letters, basically, before going into what is known as occultation, or full hiding, in 941. And he remains in hiding to this day and will only come back at the end of time to lead the community to victory and establish peace and justice in the world. Hence, he is more widely known as Muhammad al-Mahdi, or Muhammad the Mahdi. It's clear that Herbert used this real historical idea of the Mahdi, not just the particular Twelver Shi'i version, but generally in Islam, as the inspiration for the Mahdi in Dune, and he even keeps the same Arabic word for it. A second name used for this awaited messianic figure in Dune is Lisan al-gaib. This is also an essentially Arabic phrase, Lisan al-ghaib, which means something like the tongue of the hidden. I think in the recent movie they translated it as something like the voice of the hidden, which is also a legitimate translation. It's a little disputed what this is supposed to mean in the context of this story. It may have connections with Sufism, what is often referred to as Islamic mysticism, and this concept of the ghaib as the hidden aspects of reality that are accessible to mystics and prophets. For example, the famous Persian Sufi poet Hafez has been called the Lisan al-Ghaib. This would make sense as Paul/Muad'dib essentially becomes a prophetic figure to the Fremen peoples, being able to see the future and have hidden knowledge. But there's often a secondary meaning to this phrase too, as something translated to something like a voice from the outer world. It is indeed part of the prophecy that this Mahdi, or the Lisan al-Ghaib, is supposed to come from the outside, so not from within the ranks of the Fremen themselves, and this kind of makes sense too. Ghaib, thus in this case meaning hidden as in from another unknown place. I'm sure both of these etymological meanings of the phrase is considered in the story and is just one more example of the use of an Arabic and maybe even Sufi mystic phrase or term used in the Dune universe. The role of Paul or Muad'dib as the Mahdi and how he gradually grows into that role is really at the core of the first Dune book, and was one of the things that I was most fascinated with as I was watching the new film. I couldn't help but draw parallels to real historical examples of prophets or individuals that had claimed to be the Messiah or Mahdi, and how this has actually played out in history. One can see clear similarities with the story about the Prophet Mohammad, for example, and other similar historical figures. It's widely known that the story of Dune is a kind of critique or a cautionary tale about the dangers of messianic movements and how such religious fervor can be used to control people. And Herbert, as well as the movies, use some really fascinating parallels to show how such movements have actually played out in history to great effect. The way that Paul seemingly breaks certain long-held rules and customs as he proclaims his identity as the Lisan al-gaib is a common feature of real-world messiahs. In the film, and in a sequence that has basically become like a famous scene already, there's a certain council in which Paul steps into the circle, and he isn't really allowed to step into this circle unless he is a tribal leader, so this is one of the sort of rules of their culture and religion. And when someone points this out, he simply says that he's the one showing the way now, completely going against this cultural rule that they have. And this is the kind of thing we see with real historical figures that have claimed to be the Messiah or a prophet. As an example, we can look at someone like Shabtai Tzvi, a Jewish figure in the 17th century who claimed to be the awaited Messiah and seems to have convinced maybe most Jews at that time that he was speaking the truth. As part of this, he did things that completely challenged religious laws and norms. In a famous account, he's said to have walked into a synagogue and loudly said the Tetragrammaton out loud, the four-letter name of God that is forbidden to pronounce. This was utterly shocking to the congregation that was present, but also signaled that with his coming as the Messiah, things were changing dramatically. We can even consider someone like Jesus. If we are to believe the stories about him from the Bible and that he did claim to be the Messiah, the same is of course true here. Jesus openly challenged Jewish law and the authority of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. To me, as a nerd of religion and religious history, this was one of the most exciting things about Dune when I was watching the movies, for instance, being able to draw these parallels between Paul, Muad'dib, and real-world historical figures who claim to be prophets or messiahs, right? And the different sociological and psychological effects that can have on a religious community and how that can gather people together and all these kinds of things. I think that's something that that Herbert, as well as Villeneuve in the movies, captured really well. As Paul becomes, and another spoiler alert here, this is going to be like revealing some stuff that happens at the end of at least the first book. As Paul becomes the emperor, he unleashes the destructive jihad along with the Fremen, which is also, of course, taken from an Arabic word, and the Islamic religion too, where jihad means a kind of struggle and can often mean particularly armed struggle in a religious sense, so in terms of a war, for instance. Of course, in the movies, they have replaced the word jihad with holy war, which is, from one perspective perhaps understandable, but from another perspective that kind of creates even more problems surrounding that term, but whatever. In any case, these are just some of the obvious observations that one can make about the sort of core narrative of the story surrounding Paul or Muad'dib that are so interesting to me and that excited me the most as I was reading the book all those years ago and as I was watching the movies now. These parallels and examples and how they use all these religious themes and examples from history and the real world to portray this messianic figure and this messianic movement. I thought that was very powerful. But what about the wider universe of Dune and this wider world? What is religion, or how is religion tackled in this universe as a whole? What are the different religions that exist in this universe, for example? This is, of course, a vast topic, but it is one that contains a lot of fascinating material. As we saw, Herbert drew a lot of inspiration from the real world, and he wasn't afraid to use actual words and terms for some of these things, as we saw. In general, we can say that religion in Dune is based on the idea of perpetual change, you could say. That religions are always changing over time, which is of course very true. Thus we find that the many religions in this universe often have connections with religions that we find in the world today, but very much modified and sometimes even combined with each other. There is an quote-unquote official state religion of the Dune galaxy, you could say, one that is a combination of many different traditions that we know in the real world. This religion is based primarily on a scripture called the Orange Catholic Bible, which, as we said, aims to create a kind of concordance or synthesis of some of the most prominent religions in the older world. And when we take a look at these different religions from the old world, so to say, we find a whole collection of familiar names that have been combined left and right. These old religious traditions include Nava Christianity, Buddhist Islam, Mahayana Christianity, and Zen Sunni Catholicism. While the theology of this religion of the Orange Catholic Bible isn't necessarily explored in any great detail, at least as far as I know, there seems to be a belief in some sort of Trinity-adjacent God, which is sort of androgynous or doesn't have, is genderless, and which carries names like Buddha-Allah and Great Mother. Very important to the Orange Catholic Bible and the general culture of the galaxy is also something called the Butlerian Jihad. This was an event where thinking machines, so AI or robots, had risen up against humans. The humans were then forced to fight back to destroy all these machines in a kind of crusade, or a jihad. This had major impacts on the later culture, which generally forbade the creation of any thinking machines. This becomes a very important theme in the Orange Catholic Bible, where one of the key principles is that, quote, "Thou shalt not create a machine in the likeness of a human mind." Thus, in an interesting way, Dune also explores question of AI and consciousness, as well as their consequences and implications. But aside from this official religion of the Galactic Empire, different peoples, of course, have particular traditions of their own too. In terms of the Fremen, which are so central to the wider story and, of course, to our discussion today, the very complex story and lore of this people tells us that they are descendants of a people called the Zen Sunni. The Zen Sunni originated on Earth as an offshoot of a religion connected to Islam, basically. This can, of course, be heard in the second part of the name, Sunni. And to simplify greatly, the Zen Sunni is a religious group that is very Islamic in nature, but with certain features of Zen Buddhism. The lore tells us that this group of people wandered around or were moved around between different planets across history, before eventually arriving on Arrakis, where they evolved into what is known as the Fremen. And even at this point, the strongly Islamic character and features of the Fremen religion can clearly be seen. We have already, for example, explored their ideas of the Mahdi and the Lisan al-gaib. And there's also a mystical aspect to the Fremen spirituality that, at least to me, has clear parallels to Sufism. The so-called Reverend Mothers or seers of this culture, the so-called Sayyidinas, have the ability to contain within themselves the memories of all previous Sayyidinas. By drinking the water of life, which is a substance taken from the blood of these sandworms on Arrakis, they can access something called the Alam al-Mithal. This is another Arabic term and a very common aspect or theme within Sufism. It translates to something like the world of similitudes or likeness, or sometimes also the imaginal world. Another word often used for the same concept is alam al-khayal, which means literally the world of imagination, or sometimes the world of the isthmus, the world of the in-between. Particularly in famous Sufi mystics like Ibn Arabi, the alam al-khayal is a very important term that denotes a kind of intermediary world between the physical world and the spiritual. This is often the world that is the source of mystical and spiritual insight. It is by accessing this world of imagination that mystics have visions, for instance. This doctrine of imagination, so important to thinkers like Ibn Arabi, was famously written about extensively by Henri Corbin in the early to mid-20th century, and it seems to me likely that Herbert got these ideas from sources like Corbin. The Alam al-Mithal in Dune is explained as a, quote, mystical world where all physical limitations are removed. and it is accessed by the muad'dib, which gives him his prophetic powers and visions, so his ability to see into the future, for instance. The Fremen believe that each person has something called a ruh spirit, that it's always rooted in the alam and mithal and is able to access it, so to say. I don't even think I have to mention that this concept is also deeply Islamic. The ruh, or spirit, is often considered the deepest part of the human being, breathed into Adam by God in the Quran, and which often stands in contrast to the so-called nafs, or lower self, that should be fought against and conquered. This is sometimes translated as the ego. So these often stand in opposition to each other, that we have a nafs, an outer, a lower self or ego that is dangerous, that seeks power and money and fame and all these things in the world, the ego, that we are to fight against. But then at the very core of our being, there's the spirit, the ruh, which is connected more directly to the divine world, right? So these two aspects of ourselves, one which is mostly destructive and one that is more divine, is an important concept in Sufi metaphysics, and so the ruh, and not just in Sufi metaphysics, it's important in Islam generally. The idea of the ruh, or the spirit, is central to Islamic theology and to Abrahamic theology, really. And that it's very interesting that this word shows up in this way, also connected to the alam al-mithal in the Dune universe. While the Fremen religion is essentially a continuation of the so-called Zen Sunni religion that they originated from, it is said that they also adapted certain folk beliefs that were related to their home of Arrakis. For example, the great sandworms of the planet, the so-called Shai Hulud, are seen by the Fremen as a kind of manifestation of God, also called the demiurge, and they play an important role in their culture. Again, terms like the demiurge will be familiar to viewers of this channel or those familiar with Platonism and Gnosticism. The characteristic blue eyes of the Fremen are also called the eyes of Ibad. Ibad being another Arabic word which means worship, basically. This might be a reference to the Ibadi branch of Islam, or it could be just a more generic reference to the word for worship. The Fremen also have a kind of religious scripture, a kind of manual for how to survive on Arrakis, called the Kitab al-Ibar. This book contains their ilm, which means knowledge, as well as fiqh and sharia. This, in the Islamic context, means jurisprudence and law, basically. The Kitab al-Ibar is also the name of a famous work by the Muslim historian and scholar Ibn Khaldun, dealing with history and Berber culture or Amazigh culture. It seems likely that Herbert based his quote-unquote Fremen Bible on this book and was also inspired by the sociological theories and ideas of Ibn Khaldun in that book, the introduction of which, al-Muqaddimah, is one of the most famous writings in the history of the Islamic world. But the story of the Fremen is essentially one of manipulation. They are constantly being manipulated by outside sources, including their strong belief in the Mahdi. And the most significant of these forces is another key group in the Dune universe, the Bene Gesserit. The Bene Gesserit is a kind of race or order that covertly controls a lot of the events in the galaxy. They are at the center of the events of the Dune books, scheming from the shadows. These Bene Gesserit have an ability called the Other Memory, which allows them to know the memories of all other female Bene Gesserit before them. The male Bene Gesserit had this ability once too, but they lost it, and this becomes important for their activities in the galaxy. You see, one of their main goals is to create something called the Kwitzak Haderach. I totally pronounced that completely correctly. And they want to control this person through controlled breeding. This Kwitzak Haderach is to be a male Bene Gesserit that has the powers of the Other Memory, thus unlocking half of their history that had been lost with the males and gain all the power that comes with that. For this reason, among others, the Bene Gesserit are involved with spreading religious beliefs and myths to various populations in the galaxy, including the Fremen, in order to control them. This is a clear theme in Herbert's book, that religion can be very dangerous and destructive when it is used to control people. And to some degree, this is of course true. Religion is an incredibly powerful factor in the psychological and sociological aspects of human life and can inspire powerful beliefs and resulting actions, both for good and bad. And the Bene Gesserit is the very embodiment of this control through religion theme. It is by spreading the beliefs of a coming Messiah or Mahdi among the Fremen peoples that they can gain control once the Quetzalcoatl sort of appears as that Messiah. And of course in Dune, Paul, muad'dib, is of course identified as that very person. But some of the features of the Bene Gesserit also have very interesting parallels. I've heard some people say that they were inspired by Catholicism to some degree, but I have a hard time seeing at least any clear parallels between those two. If any of you have insights into that, then feel free to leave a comment and sort of let me know there. But for example, the Bene Gesserit go through a kind of training where they learn to control their nerves and muscles, their body, to withstand pain, for instance. And this training is known as Prana Bindu, which has a clear connection to Hinduism and Indic religious traditions. Prana literally means breath in Sanskrit and is used across Hindu traditions to mean a kind of life force that permeates all things, including the human body. The school of yoga, for example, sees prana as an important aspect that is controlled to create balance of this life force in the body, for instance. Bindu is a more complex term. It literally means a spot or a dot, sometimes a drop. And in a metaphysical sense, it can mean the singular point from which all things are created and return, the unity that is at the core of all multiplicity. In mandalas, for example, the middle point of that mandala is often called the bindu. According to the Dune wiki, in the context of the Bene Gesserit, it seems to be used in a sense where one trains to achieve mastery over the body through energy points, these points being the bindu, I guess. This, of course, reminds us also of the system of chakras in Hindu traditions, which is also strongly related to the prana and how one controls this life force throughout these energy channels in the body. So, as you can see, the Dune universe is absolutely packed with references and commentaries on religion as it exists in the real world. From exploring how religions evolve over time and often combine and influence each other, to clear Islamic and Sufi themes in the religion of the Fremen, and all the other religions and religious themes across the books and the movies. Not to mention that a huge part of the thematic core of the whole story deals precisely with religion, superstition, and how these things can become a powerful tool of political control. I'm so happy that the new films by Villeneuve are so good. Like, how good was that second movie? That more people will become interested and intrigued by this really, really interesting fictional universe and all these themes that are included within it. Thank you as always to all of my patrons who support this channel monetarily. All of this is thanks to you, and I am forever humbly thankful and grateful for all of your support. I would highly appreciate if anyone else wanted to become a patron, and I will leave links to that in the description. You can also support the channel by leaving a one-time donation on PayPal. Don't forget that there is a Let's Talk Religion podcast, which exists everywhere that you find your podcast if you want to listen to these episodes while you're on the go. You can also find me and my music and my other work on social media, on Instagram, on TikTok, and so on. I also have a second channel called Filip Holm that is dedicated primarily to my music and music content of different sorts. So similar content to here, these kinds of lectures and documentary style stuff, but more focused on music and music topics, right? So check that out and go subscribe to that channel. For now, I hope you found this an interesting sort of dive into the universe of Dune and the many religious themes that exist within it. I've been so fascinated by this universe for a long time, and I'm really excited about these new movies that really bring that universe to life in such a beautiful and fascinating way. So thank you all for watching. Look forward to more content like this. Let me know if you want me to tackle other fictional universes and religion within those universes. And until then, I'll see you next time.